Been a 60 Minutes correspondent since March of 1999. We all watch her reports with great interest, one of which...
91.
91? What did I say?
I don't know, but...
91. Among her interviews was one of the former CIA clandestine services chief about the use of enhanced interrogation techniques on al-Qaeda operatives, which of course is very relevant to us here today. She served before that as CBS's White House correspondent during the Carter and Reagan presidencies, and also part of the term of President George H.W. Bush. With that, Lesley Stahl.
Thank you, Clark. Well, first off, I want to say something that you all know, that this has been just a brilliant conference. As always at these conferences, you learn something, you're impressed by the high level of the people who come, and maybe best of all, it's 60 minutes each one without commercials. You really can't get better than that. And as I said, we have a really incredibly high-level panel. General Allen, who is just recently retired as commander of U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan. Ambassador Husain Haqqani at the end, who is the former Pakistani ambassador to Washington, and Ambassador Paul Bremer, who was the presidential envoy in Iraq. So I'm not going to make any speeches. I'm just going to get right to the questions. Let's start with Afghanistan. And my first question is about the pullout. And I'd like to ask you all this question. Was it a mistake, in your opinion, to telegraph the exit strategy, to announce the pullout in advance? And I'd like to start with you, General Allen.
Sure, thanks. Of course, that's received a lot of debate. In the abstract, any occasion where you simply announce the end of a war creates difficulties. And as you point out, it telegraphs our intent, it telegraphs perhaps a lack of resolve to the enemy, etc. But in this case, it was a bit different. An end date versus an end state, as Tony Thomas called it a bit earlier, was arrived at in an important way. And I think often we overlook something that occurred in Lisbon in October of 10, which was where the leadership of the NATO and partner coalition came together and determined that a process of transition would occur from that point until the end of 2014, ultimately to provide the space for the Afghan National Security Forces to move to a position where it could provide a platform for security, ultimately for the development of capacity for the Afghan government. That was a really important moment, and we often miss the fact that it wasn't an arbitrary decision. It wasn't a decision by one nation unilaterally. It was taken by the leaders of the NATO summit. And end dates in and of themselves can be very problematic if they deliver you to a precipice where nothing is envisaged beyond that. And in this case, it isn't a precipice. Almost from the beginning, with the announcement of 31 December 2014 as the end date for the ISAF campaign, we began detailed planning for what would come next. And then shortly thereafter, there was another conference, Bonn II, where after transition, we would embark on the 1st of January 2015 in something called the Decade of Transformation. The Decade of Transformation was going to be one where the Afghan National Security Forces, again, as a platform for security to buy the white space necessary for the continued development of the government of Afghanistan, would be aided by an enduring presence, an enduring military presence of the United States and our coalition allies that would continue the process of the upward spiral of professional development and professionalism of the Afghan National Security Forces. So in the abstract, an end date can be problematic if it delivers you to a precipice. And in this case, it didn't. And we accompanied often the announcement of the end of 2013 with an attempt to dominate the information space, which was also very important because we didn't want to give the Taliban narrative credibility, which is on the 1st of January 2015, there's going to be crickets heard all over Afghanistan, and the Taliban can march into Kabul and unhorse the new regime after Karzai, and it would be a Taliban fruit for the taking, for the plucking. Of course, dominating the information space meant, very importantly, conveying that we were going to be here with Afghanistan in the period of time during the Decade of Transformation. And if you've been fighting out of a cave for a long time as a member of the Taliban, and you've been hoping against hope that on the 1st of January 2015 you're going to get your way with this country, ensuring that the Taliban and ensuring that the Afghan people and the region knows that we are staying not just as a United States and a coalition force, but that we're staying committed to the development politically and militarily and economically of Afghanistan. That's a heck of a blow to the Taliban narrative.
So you are basically saying no zero option.
No, let me explain that as well. I think that's important. When I was the commander, I was never asked to evaluate a zero option. I did give the commander-in-chief my recommendation, and in conjunction with the chain of command developed, after I was given some numbers to evaluate, gave them my estimate on the efficacy of those numbers to accomplish the mission which I just told you about, which is an enduring presence force for the purpose of professional development of the ANSF. And so each one of those options had a different accompanying risk with them, but the President has had and has a series of options, one of which he can exercise as the enduring presence force. Now, we've seen this zero option ball put into the game now a couple of times, and it's been put into the game largely out of exasperation, frankly, with the rhetoric coming out of the palace in Kabul.
Right.
And I think it demonstrates very clearly that there is a limit to the patience that the American people have and our coalition allies. And the Congress has been very clear on this issue. We know, watching very closely the Soviet experience at the end of their war, that what preserved the Soviet-trained Afghan military, which was actually pretty effective military, for some period of time after the war, was the presence of advisors and the presence of a funding stream which provided sustainment to the military. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first to go were the advisors. And even with the advisors gone, that Afghan military, sustained properly, continued to fight on for several years until it collapsed with the withdrawal of all Soviet money. So we learned that lesson, and we shaped the enduring presence force both to sustain the force and to advise the force. And so if we were serious about the zero presence option or the zero option, and I haven't been in the White House sit room for some time, I would have to imagine that the conversation in the White House that day to give the President a recommendation would be a pretty grave conversation. And it would go something like this. Do we prove to Karzai that we don't want this relationship more than him by going to a zero option? In an environment where the Taliban are on the run by and large and the ANSF, as Tony Thomas correctly said earlier today, are achieving success I couldn't have imagined when I took command in the middle of 11. Do we prove that to Karzai by going to a zero option? And if we do, and we weigh the cost of doing that against more than 2,000 American dead and tens of thousands of wounded, horribly mangled in many cases by the IEDs, that's going to be a grave conversation in the White House when the time comes ultimately to decide about the zero option or to pursue one of the other options that we've given them. I'd say to the Afghan people, and I hope they're listening here, there will come a point where patience will run out with this rhetoric. And I have, for the ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I've got a good bit of experience with senior Afghan leaders, and I can tell you almost to a person, they desperately want our presence after this war. They don't want us in large numbers, but they want us there in enough numbers to help to continue to develop the ANSF. And so I would also say to the Afghan people, you can let that rhetoric drive the Afghan bus over the cliff with the difficulties that will certainly come, if the United States pulls. It's a very good chance that the Allies won't stay too. Mm-hmm. And then we'll find Afghanistan exposed to the realities of the region. Or we can take charge of the rhetoric and ultimately demonstrate that we are good partners and allies to the United States and the coalition. So the zero option has come into play a couple times, and I think it has been certainly a result of the exasperation probably in the States and in Brussels. Whether it is a serious option or not, I have not consulted with Joe Dunford. I won't ask him questions like that, but I was never asked to seriously plan for it. But it should be a very clear demonstration to the Afghan people that the United States and our allies do not have infinite patience with this kind of rhetoric.
You know, before we continue, I meant to ask each one of you to very, very briefly tell us what you're doing now. So, General, I know that you're
I retired in early April, and I have affiliations with Brookings, the Washington Institute, Center for Naval Analysis, and I'm serving now as a senior advisor to Secretary Hagel and Secretary Kerry on Middle East security issues.
Right. Paul Bremer, what are you doing now?
I'm doing some directorships of private companies and nonprofits, and I've resumed my career as a painter.
A painter. You and George Bush.
Yeah. No, I did it before he did.
Before him.
But he had shoes thrown at him before I had shoes thrown at me. So it's even.
We may get some this afternoon here.
Yeah, you never know.
I doubt it. Husain, what are you doing now?
I'm teaching and I'm writing and I'm trying to stay out of trouble from back home.
Well, I hope that won't restrain you today too much. Husain, you wrote an op-ed piece saying that telegraphing our pullout was a big mistake, a serious blunder. So, in light of what the general has said, do you still think that?
Look, in terms of the plans, I understand what the general has said, and I understood it while writing as well. But in every war, there is a political dimension and a military dimension. And I was talking about the political dimension. Basically, there is a perception around the world that Americans don't lose wars. They just lose interest. And so this telegraphing of withdrawal basically sends the same message, which reinforces Mullah Umar's perception that we have the time while the Americans have the watches. And I understand.
The watches?
Pardon?
Well, America has the watch.
Americans have the watch. We have the time. And so if that's their thinking, then telling them what is the date when you're going to leave basically tells them how long they have to wait instead of waiting indefinitely. Secondly, it also gives a wrong message to my country, Pakistan, which has been involved in Afghanistan for a long time. And while diplomatic sort of needs have been not to say that too much publicly, Americans have been reluctant to do that because no one wants to break with Pakistan. The fact remains that the Taliban sanctuary has always been in Pakistan. Right. And if the sanctuary is in Pakistan, and there are people in Pakistan who think that there is a fixed date till which the Americans are there, and after that, we will have an opportunity to go back to play the infamous great game of influence over Afghanistan, which we inherited from the British, and then go back to try and install a government in Afghanistan that is friendlier to Pakistan than it is to India, which is what the whole game has been about since the Soviet withdrawal, then that does not necessarily serve the American purpose of leaving behind a stable, strong Afghanistan that is not susceptible to Taliban pressures.
Now, you have dealt with Mr. Karzai many times. Tell us, I'm talking about the zero option. He seems to almost be goading our administration, not just to float the idea of a zero option, but to take it seriously now. He's pushing us. He doesn't want us to pull out troops.
Look, Lesley, I have been in Washington long enough to know that Washington is more about Washington than any place else in the world. But I would like to suggest to people that people should see things from the point of view of other countries as political leaders. For Karzai, Washington is important, but Kabul and Kandahar and Mazar Sharif are even more important. He is playing to his domestic audience half the time. If there could be a choreographed way of doing it, which would be if I was, for example, the Afghan ambassador, I would actually sit down with my president and say, there is a way to do this. You say this, then the Americans say that, and the message is actually worked out so that neither the people of your country feel that they've lost their sovereignty to the United States, and at the same time, you continue to have American assistance and support without the Americans feeling that you are not grateful. But there is no way to do that. So he has domestic political compulsions, just like your president has domestic political compulsions. The reason why your president had to announce a schedule for withdrawal was because of what he had promised during his run for office, and how the liberal element within the Democratic Party, the more left-wing element in the Democratic Party, felt. They wanted out of Afghanistan and out of Iraq. So why is it that all politics is local when it is about America, but it's not all politics is local when it's about Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iraq? So it's local politics, and basically it's about working out the local politics of your allies as well as your own.
Paul Bremer, talk to us about the whole general idea of pulling out, of pulling back.
Well, I think it was a serious mistake to announce a deadline. I'm not aware of any example when a war was won on a self-imposed deadline. I think that's point one. But it's more of a problem than even that, because it's of a piece with a general withdrawal of America from the region. We pulled our troops out of Iraq prematurely, a very serious mistake. We fought Libya by leading from behind. We're sitting on the sidelines in Syria. And I think the real question, we are at a hinge point in American history now. And the question is, are we going to lay down the burdens of global leadership we've borne for the last half century? That's really what is at stake. It's not just in the Middle East, but you see it most clearly in the Middle East. And I would make an argument, I can understand if you read the polls, and you've cited the example, Mr. Ambassador, about the polls in 2008, why political leaders would want to pull out. Probably a majority of people in this room, even all experts on foreign policy, think it's time for us to lay down the burden and do something and rebuild our own country. I disagree. I agree with Madeleine Albright. America is the indispensable nation. And if you look at our hegemonic leadership of the last half century, it has been a leadership which has promoted the values that America has long stood for, particularly the values of freedom, free individuals, freedom of trade, freedom of the seas. As Robert Kagan has pointed out in his most recent book, when the global hegemon basically sets the tone for the international institutions. We've done that for the last half century. The British did it for the century before that. There really are no good options to American leadership. Every option there is, and you can think of three, every option there is worse than continued American leadership. So I favor continued American leadership, which would include, by the way, the kind of continued involvement in Afghanistan. The problem with the scenario that the general accurately portrays as the government, we had exactly the same scenario for Iraq. We were going to have a strategic relationship. We were going to have troops there under a status of forces agreement. All of this went away when we pulled our troops out.
Yeah, but they don't want us there. You know, these you can't just say we want our troops there if they don't want us there.
Well, I would argue, I mean, first of all, I would defer to my colleagues here on the question of Afghanistan. They do want us there in Afghanistan. That is clear.
But
so
you didn't say reduce numbers?
Well, you know, the Afghans are interested in foreign forces going home. But they want us there. They recognize that they're not yet fully developed, especially their military, to shoulder the burden, ultimately, of securing the country and preventing the continued cross-border infiltration of the Taliban. Let me just, a very quick story. When the shooting occurred down in Panjwai of the 17 Afghan civilians who were killed, I asked the 12 or so Afghan mullahs, tribal leaders, civil society members to come to my headquarters. And I had a meal for them. I thanked them for their leadership in holding together, frankly, the province when it might have fallen apart because of the Afghan reaction to the murder of those 17 civilians. And then as I intended, based on tribal custom, I was prepared, in essence, to open my shirt and let them criticize me, you know, figuratively. Mm-hmm. And so I had the meal. I expressed my gratitude to them for their leadership in this a tremendous moment of crisis. And I said to them, now I am ready for you to tell me how you think. And I was girding myself for what would be, I thought, some pretty severe condemnation. I was shocked at the response. Not one of them criticized the United States. In fact, every one of them was unanimous in saying, please don't leave us. Please don't leave us to the region. Now, some of them wanted schools and paved roads and that sort of thing. But in the immediate aftermath of a pretty horrendous moment, their number one concern was that the reaction to this crisis might be that the United States would pull out. And without exception, they asked us to stay because They needed us because of the region.
And let me just say that it's overly simplistic to say people don't want us there. You also have to develop the capacity to be able to deal with us in ways other than either shooting us or taking us out to lunch. There's the real problem is also...
We've mastered one side of that.
The real problem is that people do want you, but they want you under certain circumstances and not in others. So when you talk to tribal leaders in Afghanistan, do they want America to bring some technology? Yes. Do they want them to bring some facilities? Yes. Clean drinking water? Yes, etc., etc. Then the problem, of course, is that the way Americans always come into a country with which there is enormous cultural difference, they don't always appreciate the cultural difference. And so you have hundreds of these 22, 24-year-olds who come sort of, as their first job, as, with some contractor, etc., etc., not knowing how to be deferential to the elders, not knowing how to deal with the mullahs, not understanding the sectarian and religious considerations. And that then causes them to get annoyed. And sometimes, of course, there is the whole question of collateral damage and the consequences of military presence, which also needs to be dealt with. So your weakness is usually in how you do it, not the mere fact that you do it.
I want to come back to Paul's overall point, but first, can I ask all of you your feelings about talking to the Taliban? I know it's created enormous strains with Karzai. It's to the point that we've come, this is the reason the zero option is now being discussed. Well, Husain, you have said it's not a good idea to talk to them.
Well, basically what I have said, of course, the headline was, don't talk to the Taliban, but if you read the piece, the last line was, or talk to them with your eyes open, which is very different to saying don't talk to them at all. Look, you have to...
in your answer also, tell us why we're talking to them.
Yeah, my point is that if you're talking to them to try and mainstream them, then please understand, nobody becomes the Taliban for improved quality of life. People join the Taliban because they have a worldview, they have an ideology, they have a belief system. They don't want girls to go to school. They don't want any external influence. They want a very medieval culture to be imposed on all of Afghanistan or all of Pakistan. So therefore, if you're going to talk to them, beware of all those factors. Don't let them drag out the talks and use the talks as a way of regrouping and avoiding conflict and avoid getting hammered. And my impression is that this happened before as well. And I was talking to Secretary Albright right here, and she remembered vaguely that whole period when the Taliban were rising in the late 1990s. And at that time also, your diplomats engaged with them, thinking that they are talking to them and there will be some kind of settlement, and then the Taliban are going to hand over bin Laden to you, and then they will live, we'll all live happily ever after, except the poor Afghan women who would be locked away. But that's not how it's going to play out. The Taliban, are not a linear organization like you are familiar with. They have factions, they have subgroups, they have tribal factions, they have ideological factions that are much closer to Al-Qaeda than others. And all of their interplay may not necessarily be easy for you to work out between now and December 2014.
Husain, you and I have talked about this before. You've dealt with them. You basically told me you can't trust them.
Well, I told you the story. I'll repeat it for the benefit of the audience. The Taliban are, of course, they grew out of the Mujahideen who fought the Soviet Union. So in 1992, the Soviet-installed government collapsed. And at that time, Pakistan was trying to install a unified Mujahideen government as an interim government in Afghanistan. And the Mujahideen factions were all killing each other. And so finally, somebody came up with the idea that if we take them all to Makkah, which is the holiest Islamic place, and make them swear on the holy Kaaba that they are going to share power, maybe these people will behave a lot better. And lo and behold, the Saudis and the Pakistanis worked together, took them to Makkah, got a deal, and
they swore on the stone.
Yeah, and one person was going to be the president for 6 months, the other one was going to take over after him, etc., etc., etc. When we came back, Prime Minister Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, his family members came and complained that he was not being allowed by Commander Massoud to enter Kabul. And so therefore they were in violation of their holy oath. When our government approached Masood's people, they turned around and said, absolutely not. We promised to recognize Mr. Hikmatyar as our Prime Minister, and by God, we recognize him as the Prime Minister. But we never agreed that the Prime Minister can actually be in the capital. Now that is a very different form of negotiation and agreement, and a very different concept of agreement than most of your diplomats have. That is why I keep warning your diplomats that please do not be misled into a negotiating process with someone whose concept of negotiation and agreement is very different from your concept of negotiation and agreement.
So understanding that, John, what is the whole point of talking to them? What is the outcome? What's the purpose of the whole idea?
Well, I would say it's not a matter of if you talk to them or not. It's a matter of when you talk to them. That's really the key.
Or why you talk to them.
Well, you want to set the conditions so that when the time comes to talk, when the time comes to bring them ultimately into the mainstream, you set the conditions for that to occur. There isn't anybody, as the ambassador said, there isn't anybody in Afghanistan, with the exception of a relatively small minority of the population, that's interested in the Taliban playing a major role in the government at this particular juncture. And it's not just a matter of sitting down at the table. We worked very hard to set the conditions, the right conditions for the timing of the talks, as well as the talks occurring as well. And those conditions had a regional implication to them. Pakistan, Iran to a lesser extent, but Pakistan. There was an effort to work at the bottom of the Taliban structure, constantly and relentlessly pressuring the foot soldiers in the field and the lower level commanders through conventional operations and special operations. We had 50 Taliban come off the field not too long ago, and they said, we always asked them, why do you surrender? Why do you come home? And surrender is not the right word, actually. We repatriate them. And they said two reasons. One was because we couldn't sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row because of special operations. They were all over us, and this was Afghan and American special operations. Mm-hmm. But the other thing they said was that we ran out of the opportunity to find foreigners to fight. And so when we were fighting people, we were fighting fellow Afghans, and when we fought them, they fought back better than we could have imagined. And so our reason for going to war, which was to fight the foreigners, had suddenly evaporated. So the point is, you set the conditions for the talks. You don't sit down and just talk, you set the conditions. There are regional conditions that have to be set. You have to pressure the Taliban structure from top to bottom, recognizing, as the ambassador properly said, the Taliban are a monolith. There are elements of the Taliban that we can splinter off and have conversations with that can create other second and third order effects within the overarching Taliban structure. Probably right now, it's not in our advantage to talk to the Taliban at this particular moment. But the time will come, and if we set the conditions properly across a variety of measures, those talks can be much more productive when the time comes.
Where does Pakistan factor into this? How do they feel about these talks? And what are they going to do about the talks?
Well, you must remember what Pakistan wants, which of course very few people understand, and those who think they do don't understand either. Pakistan basically has real threats, and then there are imaginary threats. And one of the imaginary threats is that somehow India will create a huge base in Afghanistan once the Americans leave, and that base will be used to threaten Pakistan's territorial integrity. Now, there are ways around that. Reassurance can be worked out, and that's something your government has been working on for quite some time. But the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, remains committed to having a government in Afghanistan that is beholden to them more than any other power in the region or outside. And that is where Pakistan's support for the Taliban comes in. So what does Pakistan really want out of the talks? Very frankly, they would want the Taliban to be part of a future government in Afghanistan in a significant manner, much more significant than the Afghans want it. And the only reason why they would deliver the Taliban for conversations or discussions to the Americans, we all know that most Taliban leaders are in Pakistan, would be to try and get more advantage in the outcome in Afghanistan. But here's the catch. The people that Pakistan has influence over may not necessarily remain completely in Pakistan's control once they are, say, for example, in a neutral place like Qatar. And so they want to control that process, which makes the process not Afghan-led. And when it's not Afghan-led, then President Karzai rightly reacts to that and says, if you're going to deal the government of Afghanistan out of it, then this is a conversation between the Pakistanis, the Pakistani stooges, and the Americans. Where is the Afghan government in it? And that is really a very complicated part of this puzzle.
So, Paul, what's your reaction to all this? I know you're not involved in Afghanistan, but...
No, but you know, though he may not be the most appealing leader in the world, Karzai sort of has a point about these talks, because as the ambassador points out, effectively what they tried to pull off in the first round of these meetings, and it was, after all, us meeting with the Taliban, showed him that the Taliban does not have his best interests at heart, to put it mildly. And when they put up a flag saying the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the Islamic Emirate. So it's a tricky thing. I agree with General Allen. You know, there's something to be said on the battlefield for pressing these guys really hard and getting some of them to come over. And maybe some of the village leaders will come over, and that can affect
you mean the Taliban?
Area. The Taliban.
Yeah.
But talking to the leadership of the Taliban and giving them the status of being eventually a part of an Afghan government when, as the general points out, the Afghans don't want them in the government, but they know where that leads. It leads to women no longer going to school, it leads to Al-Qaeda coming back, it leads to the whole reason for going to war.
What's the point of the talks?
Well,
I have to get back to that.
But let's remember,
is the point to get them to be part of the government? Well, if so, the Afghans don't want it.
That's the problem I have with it.
The stipulations have been all along that the Taliban would renounce a relationship with Al-Qaeda. It would acknowledge the Constitution of Afghanistan, which would also, by definition, acknowledge the rights of women, children, and minorities, and would also eschew violence. Now,
if they did that, what says they don't renege?
Well, they might renege. They might renege.
Can I ask the ambassador?
I'm all right, by the way, if they do that, there is an opening for conversation.
That's right.
Right.
However, that conversation then has to be between the Afghan elected government, the Taliban, and then Pakistan and the United States can be facilitators of that process, but they can't have the lead role. Look, Mullah Baradar, who is a Taliban number 2, who was arrested in Pakistan and is in ISI custody today, he comes from the same tribe as President Karzai. And President Karzai always thought that among the Taliban leaders, this is a man I would be able to talk to much more easily because he's from my own tribe. In our part of the world, tribe matters. It matters here too, but you know, here you call them Republicans and Democrats. But in our part of the world, the tribe matters, and Karzai thought he could talk to Baradar. And Pakistan has not yet let Baradar get into the process, holding him back. So that then makes it very difficult for President Karzai. Look, you can't ask somebody to come to talks, basically to give up everything you have or everything you have built in the last 10 years. And we shouldn't expect that of the Afghan government. Whatever comments people make about President Karzai and his government, whatever criticisms they have, some valid, some not so valid, but the fact remains that this is the government of Afghanistan that you recognize, that Pakistan recognizes, that everyone else in the world recognizes. You can't deal it out of the talks and out of the process. So if this can be done within the framework of the Afghan constitution, then that would be a success. My own fear is that the Taliban want to be able to dissimulate, get the process started, use the process for their legitimacy, and thereby shore up their support in whatever little pockets they still have of support in eastern and southern Afghanistan.
But there are very powerful forces in Afghanistan today that will work to counter the Taliban hijacking local government in some of the places where they might ultimately put down roots. The Hazaras suffered horribly under. The Hazaras are the Shia faith population in the Hazarajat, in the central portion of Afghanistan, descended from the Mongols. And of course the Northern Alliance, all across the northern tier of Afghanistan, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Turkmen. There are Pashtuns up there as well. They're not going to tolerate a peace that incorporates the Taliban in the government of Afghanistan to the detriment of all that they have accomplished as well. And they've accomplished a great deal in the last 10 years. So the diversity of the Afghan population today, which would participate under the High Peace Council and Chairman Rabbani's efforts in talking to the Taliban, I think augurs well for bringing the Taliban into a political process without necessarily having the Taliban hijack the political process. But that goes to, once again, the point of not just talking when it suits us, and setting the conditions so it'll advantage us and disadvantage them.
Well, as we listen, there are the tribes and the different sects and the Shiites and the Sunnis. It's just almost impossible for a Westerner to get his mind around all this. Paul, I wonder if you can tell us about Iraq and what the lessons were that you learned that might help us continuing forward in Iraq and Afghanistan, and if you can be candid in your answer and tell us some of the mistakes you think we made.
Well, I think there are three lessons from Iraq. The first one is, and it is relevant to Afghanistan, to Syria, to Libya, in a post-regime change situation, security is job one. It's job 1, 2, 3. It is the most important thing. We didn't get it right in Iraq until 2006.
Well, before you get to point 2, does that mean that you now think that disbanding the army was a mistake?
No. No, that's a
well, how do those two things not follow one from the other?
I can go through the whole argument on the army if you want to. It might take the rest of the afternoon.
Well, but what do you mean by security then?
What I mean was, as I have written frequently, we did not have the right number of troops on the ground in the coalition forces, nor did we have the right strategy until President Bush in 2006, in one of what I think was one of the most courageous presidential decisions of the last half century, basically decided on the surge in Iraq. So job one is get security right. And the second thing that you got to do is you've got to understand that the moving from a dictatorship, now I'm not talking about Afghanistan here, it's more Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, moving from the dictatorship to representative government takes a very long time. And so the third point is you can't leave until the job is done. You're going to have to stay. And pulling out of Iraq at the end of 2011 was a mistake in Iraq. We lost what leverage we had over the government there, and there's been a lot of backsliding under al-Maliki since then. And I think I have that in my mind when I look at the question of fighting the war in Afghanistan under a self-imposed deadline. Now, maybe we'll get away with it. Maybe, unlike Iraq, we will have a good presence in Afghanistan after the end of 2014. I certainly hope so. But the message to people in the region of what we've done in Iraq, in Libya, in what we've not done in Syria, is a message of American withdrawal. And when the world's most powerful nation withdraws from the world's most turbulent region, it cannot be good for American interests.
Can I know you didn't want to get into the weeds on the disbanding of the army, but let me ask you if that wasn't a central problem that led to the unraveling in a way.
No, that was not the problem.
Can you tell us your answer on that?
Well,
I'm sorry, but
first of all, the mistake I made was using the verb disbanding. There was no army to disband. As General Abizaid reported in a telephone conversation, he was then deputy commander in CENTCOM, there was not a single unit of the Iraqi army standing to arms anywhere in the country at the end of the war. There was no army. The question was, should we recall the army? And there were very strong practical and political reasons not to recall the army. The political ones I'll focus on. The Shia, who make up something like 60% of the population, were cooperating with the occupation under orders from Grand Ayatollah Sistani. The Kurds, who probably make up 20% of the population, were very clear to me. They said, if you recall that army, we're going to secede from Iraq. To me, that was a red line, because the secession of the Kurds would have been the breakup of Iraq. It would have started a civil war immediately in 2003. It would have drawn in the regional powers. The Iranians are never going to be satisfied with an independent Kurdistan on their border because they got a lot of Kurds. Yeah. So we built the army from the ground up. The army has turned out to be the most respected institution in Iraq. We did recall the police. The police are still a problem in Iraq. The police are also a problem in Afghanistan. The police are much harder in many ways to stand up than armies. So anyway, that's not what led to the problem. What led to the problem was we were not configured from a security point of view with sufficient troops pursuing the right strategy. a counterinsurgency strategy. We didn't really get there until 2007 when the surge was in effect and General Petraeus' new strategy was put into effect.
Husain, talk to us about conditions right now in Pakistan, the relationship of the military to the civilian government, the situation with the United States. Can you describe
look,
it?
Pakistan's situation has not changed particularly. The government has changed, but civil-military relations haven't changed. The military still thinks that it alone is the arbiter of national interest and it alone should decide national security policy. We have a new civilian government which, because it's newly elected, will probably have more credibility than the last one had towards the end of its tenure. But then we have to see how this government will be perceived by the time its tenure comes to an end. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, like President Zardari, started by saying that Pakistan needs to normalize relations with India. Within the few months that he's been in office, in fact less than 2 months, already the military and the intelligence machinery is generating a backlash against him, telling him, no, 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 we need to settle our issues with India before we start normalizing with India, which is the traditional pattern. So the civilians will come under pressure and will probably back away. And we will be back to the original issues of Pakistan needs to secure itself first before it can start educating its children. Pakistan has some serious crisis within. I mean, of all the South Asian countries, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan has the lowest school enrollment, highest infant mortality. The country has less security. A lot of Pakistanis have been killed by terrorists and therefore would like the terrorism problem to be dealt with. But there is still no recognition on the part of the intelligence service and the military that their old game of choosing between good Taliban and bad Taliban and good jihadi groups and bad jihadi groups has not really worked for Pakistan. So it will take some time before Pakistan turns away from jihad completely, and while that is going on, it will continue to pay the price that it is paying. Relations with the United States will again be up and down because on the one hand, Pakistan needs the United States for economic reasons. It needs the equipment for its military, etc., from the United States, and it certainly does not want to go into isolation. But at the same time, it wants to exercise greater leverage in the relationship with the United States and not give up its own regional priorities. So it will be 2 steps forward, 2.5 backwards, 2 forward, 1.5 back, and that's the way this game is going to go for the foreseeable future. I have a book, commercial break. I have a book coming out on this. I have a book coming out on this by the end of October, which is Magnificent Delusions, Pakistan, the United States, and the History of an Epic Misunderstanding, which will try and explain this to Americans if they want to understand it.
Well,
I've pre-ordered the book, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
I hope we do want to understand it. And before I throw it to the audience for questions, John, what is your perspective on our relationship with Pakistan? Do you see it improving? Do you see it deteriorating? Do you think we're going to just muddle through?
Well, as the ambassador rightly said, it waxes and wanes. We have frequently pegged the relationship against the crisis of the moment. And I think that there is strong strategic logic for trying to bring stability and normalcy to the relationship as much as we possibly can. But we also have to recognize that Pakistan is experiencing enormous pressures on any given day. An economy that is very challenged. The IMF is literally ready to walk away. An electrical grid that's flat on its back. A security situation that does not, in many respects, augur well for foreign direct investment. The military has been fighting almost continuously now for almost 3 years on the east side of the border with Afghanistan. The numbers of casualties that the Pakistani military has sustained far exceed, in just the 3 years they've been fighting there, what we've experienced in the entire war with the same numbers of wounded from IEDs. And the country sits on top of 100 nuclear weapons. And so there are really compelling imperatives for the United States to look for ways to seek to stabilize Pakistan. We've got to be careful about an approach that seeks to constantly punish Pakistan, because you can never be certain in this environment where Pakistan is beset with internal extremism, internal terrorism, the difficulties associated with its infrastructure and its economy. You can never be certain what combination of circumstances inflicted could create the beginning of the dissolution of the state. So we've got to be very careful about this. And I think there are real strong incentives for the United States to pursue a continued policy to enhance our relationship with Pakistan, to stabilize the country. And by the way, a stable Afghanistan, Afghanistan that is buoyed by an ANSF which is capable after 2014 of providing the security white space for the continued development of the Afghan government, and very importantly, the continued development of the Afghan economy. A stable, economically vibrant, politically capable Afghanistan is one of the most important reasons for Pakistan to become involved in supporting the peace process in Afghanistan, because there was a long period of time when it was all about Pakistan being supportive of the outcome in Afghanistan. I would say today, if we are successful in this campaign and Afghanistan becomes a stable democracy that is able to exploit the extractive industries which are there in the trillions of dollars of potential, Afghanistan could well be an extraordinarily important factor in the long-term stability of Pakistan. So there's a compelling reason for us to do all we can to help Pakistan at this point.
It's killing me to turn this over to you, because I have a million questions, and so do you. So, Dan.
Thank you. Great panel. Dan Raviv, I really appreciate it. General Allen, to you especially, thank you for appearing here 3 months after retirement. Have you been home long enough to get a feel for what the American people think about the war in Afghanistan, whether we are winning or losing? Are we leaving in defeat? Do you have a keen idea now as to what Americans think?
Afghanistan, and I'll just as a prelude to this, I have had the opportunity to serve or to be present on the ground in places like Colombia and Mindanao and Indonesia and Bosnia and Iraq and Afghanistan. Of all those places, the complexity that I encountered in Afghanistan far eclipses all of those. Afghanistan is a country that has been for 1,000 years the place between empires. It was the grindstone between the Persians and the Bactrians and the Mughals and the Macedonians and the Mongols. And for a long, long time, there was no sense of being an Afghan. Today, this new generation that's emerging from the school system, for the first time, Tony talked about millions of kids and the many, many young ladies who are in school today, is changing that. Afghanistan, I think, will no longer be the place between empires. I think Afghanistan is emerging with its own unique quality to it. So Americans ought to take the time to see what has really been accomplished in Afghanistan, and many, I think, appreciate that the numbers of kids who are in school, the improvement in healthcare capacity, the numbers of children that are born and survive to the age of 5, the numbers of mothers that survive childbirth, the improvement in literacy, the improvement in life expectancy, all of those things against all reason, had we not been in Afghanistan, would not have improved. And so we have accomplished a great deal. The question isn't whether we've done it or not. The question is, have we talked about it properly or not? America is a country that has given us, the military, incredible support. Incredible support. Through the Congress of the United States, I never wanted for anything as a commander either on the ground in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And I'll be grateful to the last breath I take on the planet for the support of the American people. But the American people can be excused for not necessarily grasping the complexity of what's occurred in Afghanistan. And as you draw back from Afghanistan, we're 12,000 miles from here right now, Afghanistan can be reduced to very simple terms. And so I think for a lot of Americans, Afghanistan is in the rearview mirror. The war is over for all intents and purposes. And I think that's unfortunate, because America ought to be proud of what we have accomplished there, and certainly proud of the magnificent performance of the young women and men in uniform who have done so much for that country and so much for our own stability. You know, Tony Thomas is a good example. He's in here somewhere. I asked him a little while ago, if you saw his uniform, he had 13 combat hash marks on his sleeve. For those of you who are not familiar with that designation, each one of those hash marks is 6 months in combat, 13 of them Now, a Marine can do the math. That's a long time.
The rest of us can't.
And our troops have really done magnificently. So I think the American people have supported our troops magnificently, while they may have been ambivalent about the cause. So I'll just leave it at that at this point.
I see a man in a white shirt. Holler out.
Sheriff Hal Cannon from Charleston, South Carolina. To pick up on that, I had an opportunity to participate with Robert O'Brien and Arent Fox in a public-private partnership to reform the judiciary. Judge Steve Larson was at a reception in Washington. Justice O'Connor was there, and one of the speakers was the female, and these were female Afghan legal professionals, was the chief prosecutor for narcotics for the country. And to listen to her accounting of how she lived and her family lived and how she came into that position, it occurred to me, and my question is, do you think the media has done a good job of educating Americans about the Afghan people?
No bashing the media here.
No.
I'm listening to my coach.
Thank you.
I think, again, it's not necessarily about the media. It is sometimes an irresistible tendency to simplify Afghanistan. And it is an enormously complex environment. You know, we have had really significant success in the North and in the West fighting the Taliban. We've got a hell of a fight still in the East, and the South is in pretty good shape. And a lot of that's because of the work of our special operators. And what we have discovered is that, as we have seen in other places, like in Colombia and in where I lived in Iraq and Al-Anbar, as you disposed of the insurgents, the ideological insurgents, what you often found was that the insurgency was laminated on top of the criminal networks. Criminal networks knew how to smuggle guns. The criminal networks knew how to launder money. The criminal networks knew the routes. And often the insurgents laminated themselves on top. And as we eliminated the insurgents in large parts of the country, we found ourselves now fighting a criminal element. And so the complexity is enormous in Afghanistan. And the closer you get to it, the more complex it is and the more it defies simple answers. And so I really am glad you had the chance. I'm not sure who you spoke to, but there's a woman who's a public prosecutor out in Herat. She's a hero to all of us. She lives every day in danger because she is putting the wood to the Taliban and the criminals out there, not just the Taliban. And the more of them we are able to get into the government of Afghanistan, the greater the health, I think, of Afghanistan over the long term.
And Lesley, not to bash the media, but to defend it, the media has not reported something that hasn't happened. The only thing is that there is a lot happening and not everything can be reported. And so that is the real reason why, and explaining some complex situation to another culture, to another country, to another nation, is not important. I mean, people want to know what Lindsay Lohan did last night, you know. So I don't blame the folks on 24/7 news channels from not covering Afghanistan and the poor women of Afghanistan. That was of course a sarcastic remark in case people don't understand Pakistani sarcasm.
I think we got the sarcasm right here.
Lesley, you asked the perfect questions.
I did? Oh, good.
Iraq, gosh, we've made such sacrifices. Can you tell us, is there hope? I mean, is this a Shia, Sunni war that we're going into now? What's your hope for the future?
Well, there are two possible foreseeable outcomes, maybe more, but just to take the extreme ones. The positive possible outcome is that in 5 years, Iraq is the best governed, most progressive country in the Arab world. And I think that's still possible. They still have the best and most progressive constitution anywhere in the region. They have the wealth, unlike Afghanistan has potential wealth, but not real wealth. Right. Egypt has got a real problem. The Iraqis could make it. It's a possibility. The other one is a much darker future, which depends a lot, I think, on what happens in Syria. Because if Syria comes apart, and there, to me, is no indication that we're prepared to hold it together, if Syria comes apart, then I think there's a real, as there already has been a little bit in both Jordan and Iraq, there's likely to be a spillover And you might then get to the situation that I talked about when I answered the question about the army, where you start to have an independent Kurdistan begin to emerge in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and then you've got a real problem for the Iranians because the Kurds are the second largest minority in Iran. And that's a much darker situation where you get a pulling apart of Syria, effectively a tearing up of the Sykes-Picot arrangement of 1922, which the British and the French organized at the end of the First World War, where these states begin to come apart. And that's a much darker future. But I still think it's possible that Iraq can come out all right. A lot will depend on the elections next year. Al-Maliki has clearly gone into reverse since we pulled our troops out. And in my view, but there are some other ambassadors to Iraq who know better than I do here in the room, I don't think we've been tough enough in private with al-Maliki since he started going into reverse in 2012 and this year. I think we have let him get away with a little bit too much. He's reverting.
Way over there.
Jim Jeffrey.
Speaking of ambassadors who know more about Iraq.
You know, I was looking out.
First of all, I agree with essentially everything Jerry said, but my question is a little bit different. The proximate cause that we couldn't keep a small training military force in Iraq in 2011 was not that the Iraqis didn't want us, but that they didn't want a legally binding, parliament-passed status of forces that would grant essentially total legal immunity to our forces. I understand that's a major issue now with Afghanistan. It also, in terms of our forces and our diplomatic presence and immunities, an issue that has come up in Pakistan as well. Are we pushing the envelope so much on these issues that we aren't going to be able to operate in some of these countries? Thank you.
Can I just answer on Iraq before he answers
on
Afghanistan? Jim, of course, knows the details better than I do. We, of course, can't operate without a SOFA, no question. We operate in whatever it is, 82 countries around the world with SOFAs. So we have to have a status of forces agreement. In my view, one was doable. We made an unacceptable, if I were al-Maliki, unacceptable demand on him that it be approved by his parliament, which, as you know, Jim, is not something we normally do. Most SOFAs are approved by the executive or by whatever process the host country wants to approve. We insisted incorrectly, in my view, on him getting that through Parliament, which put him in a difficult political situation. But I defer to John on the question of Afghanistan, or more generally.
Yeah, I think a couple of the biggest differences that I would see is that we began the process of negotiating the bilateral security agreement much earlier than we did with its corresponding agreement in Iraq. And there was, as a direct result of Karzai's convening the Loya Jirga, which 2,500 Afghans, prominent Afghans from across the country, who spoke unanimously in favor of a long-term international, read U.S. presence, there was popular support for an American presence. And we began the process early enough that we could conceivably, logically conclude the process in time. So we're playing a bit with fire when we stop the negotiations in order to prove a point. And I tried to find out this morning, someone here may know, I don't think we've started the negotiations back up again, but there's a really practical circumstance which could generate the zero option in and of itself, and that is if the talks fail. We have two good teams, an Afghan team and an American team, who are negotiating across the table from each other. They're highly qualified diplomats, and they're well suited to the process. So left to itself, I'm actually confident that the bilateral security agreement, which is emerged from the strategic partnership agreement, will be successfully negotiated. We will protect the judicial and the jurisdictional interests of our troops. And that will pave the way for for Afghanistan ultimately to approve our enduring presence force. Absent the bilateral security agreement, we go to a zero option automatically. And the President was very clear in that to President Karzai in public.
As I understood your question, it was about whether you made demands that were just not acceptable to the other side or were too much. And I think that has to be there has to be considerable thought given to what and how you're going to demand it. You sometimes take a very legalistic, American legalistic approach to issues which may have alternative solutions within the context of legal arrangements available in that particular country. I refer you to the Raymond Davis question, who finally did come out. And we would our argument was, you wanted the guy, you got him. Whether you got him on the principle of Islamic law, which is part of the Pakistani legal system, or what you wanted to, the legal argument that you were making, shouldn't be the issue. And I think you should have that flexibility in talks with your allies, who are all in very difficult positions.
Very, very sadly, we have run out of time. Just want to say very quickly that I think we as a country are just so lucky to have people of such high quality coming into public service. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done.
I think we did all right.
You can fool half the people half the time. We're all great.